Welcome to Season 3 of Maintaining Mental Fitness, a free webinar series to support mental fitness for organizations and individuals in an endemic world.
Just a pre-frame for our conversation today, and I'm going to go through this quickly, so then we'll open up to the Q&A with Alana and myself. I'd just be curious, and you can either share this in the chat if you feel comfortable, or just reflect on it yourself. How are you feeling right now? What would be maybe a word that best describes the emotions that you might be feeling if you were paused to think about it? I know often when we do these types of talks, there could be varying degrees of feelings. There could be excitement, energized, hopefulness, anxiousness, overwhelm, fear, anger. All these different things could be going on. And I just like for you to pause for a second to think about, where am I today in space and how am I feeling as I get ready for our conversation? Great. Just to set the tone as well for the rest of the topics, as Alana mentioned, I'll be doing today around creating space for discomfort. Next week, we'll have a DEI expert coming in to help provide us some considerations for as we reintegrate into the workplace and continue to reintegrate, how might we want to think about diversity, equity, and inclusion? And what aspects might that play as we're going through that? And then finally, we're going to be speaking with Lillian Reed-Allen, who works with the LCBO and leading their mental health strategy, and helping us provide a conversation around learning from the discomfort that we might be feeling. And we'll talk a little bit more about that today. Just to kind of set the stage and share some insights that we've been noticing as we've been supporting organizations in the last few years, is that there's been some real shifts that are continuing to happen, as well have happened inside of companies. And the first that we're noticing is inside the workplace experience, there's been some things that have really evolved. The first that we've noticed is that workplaces are really engaging and are continuing to engage in significant change and growth. And this might be from a desired revenue perspective, how you're utilizing technology, how you're structuring your workspace. It's a number of varying things that are going on. But ultimately, we're finding that organizations are saying, yeah, let's keep pushing forward. Let's keep growing and growing and growing, which is a real exciting thing. But as we move through some of the other bullets on this slide, it can cause a sense of pause. And one of those reasons that might cause a sense of pause is that how we work is being redefined. And for the how we work, it's not only the tools or the widgets that we use to do our work, but it's also the way in which we live up to the values of the organization. The way for some groups that might have defined respect as something or connection as another thing. The behaviors that we're doing in this sort of changed work environment might be very different in terms of how we live up to those expectations and values. I know in working with municipalities a fair bit, there was such a high degree of conversation around the enjoyment that would come from doing like a trailer talk prior to going out for the day if you're in the operations arm of the municipality. And that might not be something that's happening the same way. And so it's really forcing organizations to possibly pause to think about how are we going to live up to the expectations that we started and maybe evolve those expectations to mean something different. The second or the third that we're noticing is at the individual level, people are still underneath this threat response. If you followed along any of the work that myself or Dr. Howitt or another of our colleagues, Dana Lee Bagley, have done, we talk a lot about this idea of pandemic brain, and that our brains are kind of in this increased threat with all the different things going on around us. What we've noticed is that's still holding true, and that it's coming through in the sense of reduced capacity, in that, we talk a lot about the idea of, everyone has a limited number of brain units to do the work they need to do on a daily basis. And if that number is 10, let's say, something we've noticed is that the average person right now might only have 7 brain units, and that's 100% charge. and that we're not actually getting up to that full capacity. And that's not necessarily because the person's not resilient. It's just all of the things that are happening and coming on is that we're finding it difficult to create that recharge or even get back up to full capacity. And then finally, we're noticing at the individual level, people are really starting to question and re-examine, what is it that I want, or what is it that I need, and where can I find that? So I'm sure many of you have heard things like the quiet quitting, or things like the great resignation and all this different stuff. And a word that really resonates with us is that it might be more around the great reevaluation, in that COVID provided the opportunity for individuals to have an exposure to doing work differently and living differently, maybe. And some things might have been good, some things might have been challenged, but ultimately what we're noticing is that individuals are saying, you know what, I need to start questioning how and where and who and what I'm doing on a daily basis, and particularly within inside of the workplace. The other big bucket that we're noticing change happen is inside of leadership, in that the way leaders show up is requiring a different mode of operating. So the first bullet there around leaders often have less answers. That doesn't mean that we don't know things. What I'm really saying there is that the problems that leaders seem to be facing right now are very, very complex and may not have a finite or simple answer to get to it. And so it's forcing leaders to ask more questions, engage with more people, to try to figure out how to navigate through something like reintegrating into the workplace, or social justice issues, or workplace flexibility, whatever it might be. It's really, we're noticing that it's becoming more and more challenging for one person to be the knower of all information. The other element that we've noticed that's really evolved over the last 30 years in particular is this idea that from a leadership perspective, leveraging control and even fear-based leadership is not what's starting to create is not maximizing employee productivity. There's a big move towards how do we foster more influence and possibly connection with our people, so there's that increased willingness to do the work, as opposed to saying, well, if you don't do it, I'm going to fire you, or I gave the order, so it's a must do afterwards. And we're noticing on the flip side that it might be creating some challenge for people who are maybe more comfortable or used to, or come up in operating in that type of control, fear-based type of leadership. And this isn't one of accusations, just what was done within the workplace culture, is that it feels then, well, how do I actually maintain accountability? Because I feel like unless I'm working with my people and they have beanbag chairs and ping pong tables and are getting everything they want, they're not happy. Well, that's a really different thing than actually ensuring that you have clear boundaries around accountability and what it means to show up. So this difficulty that we're finding leaders are having in holding themselves, their team accountable to either hitting targets or, again, how people are showing up, has created some real challenge and unsureness of how to move forward. And then finally, there's this increased expectation that as a leader, you need to support the whole person. I know the previous sort of generations and years of work, there was sort of the idea, well, you leave your stuff at the door. When you come into the workplace, you drop all your baggage at the front door, you come in, you do your work, and then when you leave, you can pick it all back up again and go home. Well, this is just not happening, not only because of our physical space are blending, but our actual social, interpersonal, intrapersonal things that are going on inside of our own head are blending in such a great degree that individuals are looking for leaders that consider the whole person and not just the function that they're doing. And then finally, we're noticing these evolving expectations from an individual and employee perspective, where there's this desire to see how are we engaging in two-way conversation. As I said earlier, not just giving one-way directives, but having the opportunity to ask questions, be a part of the process moving forward. There's a desire to take on big conversations. I know with a number of the organizations that we speak with, often we'll start sessions with a land acknowledgement or different types of things that are now a part of and ingrained in the workplace experience, where there's an expectation to say, what's your perspective on diversity? What's your perspective on Black Lives Matter, on Indigenous relations, on gender, whatever it might be? And these are things that are now being brought into the workplace. And many individuals are even looking at the workplace to say, okay, is this an organization that moves into that space, moves towards, hopeful evolution and whatnot? There's a desire to say, I want to be felt like I'm seen and heard and welcomed into the space. And if that's not, I'm going to look for somewhere different. And then finally, there's this growing desire around being engaged and empowered. I was doing a talk yesterday actually for a group of accountants, and it's an interesting thing noticing that the perspectives of like, well, you've got these people that are new in the workplace and they're thinking they know everything and have everything. And really, when we boil it down, often what it comes down to is a need or a seeking of autonomy, to be feeling like I'm empowered and can control and be, trusted with something to move forward on, whether it is like a small project or a larger project. But either way, individuals and employees are seeking to find space in which they can be involved with that. So for moving forward, what we're really noticing is that in order to create this thriving space for people to feel welcome, included, and supported, that organizations really have the responsibility to create that space where it is flexible, it is equitable, it's diverse, it's inclusive, and they can use policies and procedures and different elements. Leaders have the responsibility to facilitate that space through the skills that they're bringing to the table and how they're approaching supporting their staff and even role modeling their own behaviors. And then finally, individuals have the responsibility to contribute to that space. And the words there are very intentionally chosen. And then ultimately it does start at the organization in terms of setting the environment where people can thrive. And then the leaders have an integral role to play in terms of facilitating that environment and holding it true within the norms that are existing across each of their team. And then finally, that individual has to own the things that they can control through their own self-awareness, their own growth and development, their own advocacy, and really contribute to that space. And without these three things working in synergy, it can be really, really challenging going forward. And so why I wanted to give that pre-frame is just to highlight some of the elements that we're probably going to be covering through as we move through the season 3, and really acknowledge the fact with so much changing and so many new things, it's likely we might spend a whole bunch of time feeling uncomfortable as we navigate through these new norms, not to transition and set yourself up, Alana, for our first kind of back and forth.
Yeah, no. Jesse, what really resonated with me is you're talking about the 3 large elements that impact this: organization, leaders, and individuals. So this first session is really about how do we do that? So creating space for discomfort is real. So in that, why is creating that space for discomfort something we really should be thinking about?
Yeah, it's a great question. And for me, what we've come to learn within that idea is I've noticed that a lot of organizations are doing some really interesting work and even innovative work on implementing either, kind of evolved policies or practices or giving their people tools. I was listening to a presentation yesterday on the requirements of digital transformation and how far Canada is even behind other countries relating to digital transformation in terms of, their maturity. And so there's all this stuff going on that I think if we all say, oh, we should probably be, cutting edge digital material, or we should probably, have the best tools to do the work. But what I've noticed that we might not consider is how does it feel to do all of that? And for me, unless we're creating space to acknowledge how it might feel, it increases the risk of it failing, to be frank, or not landing the way that we're expecting it to land. Because it's often, and I come back to even behavioral change, it's often not that people know they should do something. It's whether they're motivated or bought into or see importance to whether they want to do it or not. And a really good way to do that is to acknowledge the feelings and be aware of them as you're moving through. And so ultimately for me, as I said, as we were wrapping up, I really strongly believe with all of this change and all of this evolution that might be happening, we're going to be feeling a whole bunch of things. And unless we create space, we're either going to fail, like at the best case scenario, or we're going to create a whole bunch of friction and a whole bunch of challenges around things like, possible things like discrimination or bullying or harassment. Because if we're not acknowledging the feelings, what can often happen is that we revert back to either fight or flight and trying to survive. And sometimes those behaviors can be ones that create more pain than maybe do harm or do good.
I'm gonna put you on the spot here. So
Okay.
sorry about that. But we talked about these three different groups, right? Organization leaders and individuals. Do you have a sense or an opinion of one that may be a driver, like one that can really set the tone or really disrupt this whole progression?
Sure. Yeah, what I'll always preface that it's, coming from possibly a bias through my lens, and that lens being one who is a leader of our own organization and, supports number of leaders through other organizations. And so I am biased to put a fair bit of ownership on the plate of leaders, in particular senior leaders. They often are going to set the infrastructure for creating that environment. And then people are going to look to them in terms of how they role model those behaviors, how they maintain the accountability. And, it's the great duality of being a leader is that it comes with a ton of privilege, but that privilege comes with power. And in that power, I've used the analogy sometimes when speaking with leaders, act like a speedboat on a small lake that's doing donuts. And if you think about your team members or your clients or the things inside of organizations, like those docks that are on the shoreline, and if that speedboat keeps doing donuts, those docks start going like this and bouncing all over the place. And so for me, really understanding, that, and I really think that that's where, the idea of creating space for discomfort is almost most important, to be honest with you, is that leader level. And I'm sure we'll get into this later, but I know even for myself, many things I've had great intentions of moving forward and supporting team members and helping. And in asking the question of how was that experience for you, sometimes the information that comes back is really, really uncomfortable, in that I actually had the opposite effect of what I was intending to have. And, that can be really challenging to navigate through as an individual in those roles.
Okay. So with, again, bringing this back to creating that uncomfortable space, how would you incorporate this into your daily experiences? And from a leader's perspective, individuals, like
Sure.
How do you feel about that?
Yeah, so I think there's a few things that we can consider. Maybe I'll start like organizationally, and then I'll kind of navigate through. So like as an organization, one thing that we encourage groups to consider is, while they're implementing some form of change, to ensure that a part of that change is having conversations with the people. And for me, when I say conversations, that's a little different than what we might consider to be communication, in that, a whole bunch of emails, a bunch of posters telling everyone what's going to happen. For me, a conversation is asking people, what would you be looking for if this was happening? How does it feel when it's happening? Getting their perspective as opposed to talking at them, I think, is so critical. So whenever you're doing some form of new implementation or policy or whatever, creating that space to have a two-way dialogue. Because the other thing that I've come to learn is that sometimes you get incredible insights from the place that you weren't expecting, or the place that you might not have thought was going to happen, and that has nothing to do with necessarily how long the person's been in the organization, or what their credentials are. And so taking that time really can help in moving the things forward. On the leader level, I would say the same thing in terms of, as you're leading the people around you, try to meet them where they feel most comfortable and check in on how they're doing as people, beyond just the function, but really checking in with them. Then on an individual level, that one, if you have the perfect answer, I'd also love that help, because I don't know if I figured out exactly. But for me, the thing that I found most helpful is trying to find time for quiet, which I know is an easy thing to say, often a hard thing to do. And I can share that from, having an organization. Since the last time we've spoken, I now have 3 young girls, 4.5, 3, and 6 months. And so quiet isn't something is of high demand around our house, but, taking that time to notice what it is you might be feeling, and then ask yourself the question of, why am I reacting this way to it? And, kind of giving yourself literally time and space is really the only thing I think you can do And the last thing I'll mention on that is even just having compassion that you're probably not going to get it perfect all the time. You're probably going to make a bunch of mistakes along the way, I think is also pretty critical to recognize.
Yeah, and I think we need to remember that we're human beings and we're going to have missteps, and we just need to embrace that and look at the opportunities within that.
100%.
I agree. Okay, so with all this that we've talked about today, this is an evolution, right? There's going to be ups, there's going to be downs. So what would you say is the one thing, because I think there's a lot, but the one important thing that we should keep learning and then relearning through this process and this evaluation?
Yeah. And to me, I mean, it really comes along the lines of what you just said, is that we're human. And I remember speaking with an organization recently, we were presenting some results of one of our tools, and someone was saying, what do you do if you don't get as high a score as what you're hoping? And I, jokingly said, well, congratulations, you're a human being, because you're probably not going to get 100% anyways on these things. And I think that's exactly it, is that, recognizing that we're going to make mistakes. For me, the one that I feel really speaks loudly is when you're in a conversation and maybe you're receiving information that you're not enjoying hearing. Perhaps it's something that you did that someone said, hey, I felt left out, or I felt like, disrespected, and in our heads, we want to quickly jump to, well, why that might not be the case. Like, why might it not be the case, Alana, that you feel disrespected? And I immediately want to jump in to defend myself. And I think that's the thing that I really find we do need to learn and relearn and learn and relearn, is that this is going to be hard. And likely when we're navigating through all of this stuff, we're going to be receiving information that we don't really want to hear, and that our ego and our defense system is going to come up to protect us. And in that, we might sometimes say things that we're not super proud of, or do things that we're not super proud of, or we didn't want to do. And so for me, the more that we can then recognize, oh, wait a second, that was my defense system going off, and not actually what I'm thinking or feeling after that defense system came down and I actually heard what the information was coming at me. But that is the one I feel that, we're really going to face, particularly at the leader level, just coming back to them, where, a lot of what I was just suggesting or putting forward is actually saying, like, as leaders, we need to redefine how we lead. And the things that probably got us into that leader position are not going to be the things that allow us to stay there and have the privilege to lead our people and have the most impact inside of our organizations, our community, and our people moving forward. So I really think kind of recognizing and possibly reflecting on that defense system that might fire as we're kind of navigating through these things is the thing that I would really say is the learning, relearning as you go through it.
Okay, well, thank you. Yeah. I just want to do a time check here. I know we're getting close to the half-hour mark, and just want to open it up if there is anyone else that might have any questions. There's some great articles and comments in the chat. Following this, just want to remind you all that this will be recorded. It'll be available on the website. Any materials will be available, thereafter. Please reach out to us if there's, anything you have. And just to remind you that we do have the next session, September 27th, which is incorporating DI into your renewed culture.
Yeah, that one is it. I'm excited for that, listening to that one, because I think it's at the root. I remember talking to a consultant who does a lot in this space, and she was sharing with me that when organizations were integrating that, she did a lot of supporting of either Black leaders or new Black employees. And one thing that was brought forward was, well, while we were home, I was able to grow my hair out and put in dreadlocks or have an afro. And now I don't know if that's acceptable in the workplace. And so I'm just really fascinated to see the insights that she's going to bring forward on, we're not going to have it all solved probably in 20 minutes, but how to move forward with, those conversations.
Yeah, I know you're right. We will not have it all solved in 30 minutes, but at least they'll bring, a lot more awareness and an opportunity to ask some really engaging questions, just to get a bit more comfort around it. Because, when you say DEI, there's a lot of people that maybe don't truly understand what that means. So I think that that's important to recognize.
Yeah, and there's a really interesting video just on that point that I listened to with Adam Grant recently, and the question was asked around like how values might be redefining in our society, and he actually said, he asked the question like, do you think that's the case? Do you think values are redefining, or is it more how we live them? And I was running and I was really reflecting on that point, and for me, the thing that I took from it is that, you know what, you're right. And the reason being is, so when I grew up, if I want to pick out one of them, respect was a big thing. And what I was told in order to demonstrate respect was often, if I think of like my grandparents, you know, you would get up if they came into the room and give them your seat. You would go get them things if they asked for it. It was very like servant based, kind of like you're, and in many cases, understandably so, but you're the best thing, you're the person of power, and I need to demonstrate, you know, that power. And now when I think of respect, I think of very different words that come up. Like for me in the work, and again, I might be biased in the work that I do, but the things I'm continually hear more about is respect is about, you know, how do we be more inclusive? How do we be more mindful of differing perspectives? How do we support one another? And one thing that I find really interesting is the behaviors that might be done to move towards being more inclusive. It's possible some of those behaviors might be in conflict with the behaviors that would have been demonstrating respect 30 years ago that I was brought up to told, this is how you show respect. And I think that that's a really interesting thing that organizations might miss, particularly long-standing ones, that they have these values on the wall that meant something 30 years ago. They still might be true today, but they might mean something else. And we just haven't spoken about, well, what do they mean? How do we show that in this evolved world? And I think that comes back to that idea of creating space for even that discomfort, and that, hey, we might need to acknowledge the ways in which we demonstrate these things is going to be very different than what we did in the past. And, you know, it's okay to feel fearful or worried or scared about that. Let's just talk about it.
Yeah, I think we've all heard this. What's the new normal? Well, that is a very big question that none of us know the answer to. So we're on this journey together.
Exactly. Yeah. Yeah.
And I know we're a minute over, but just thank you so much, Jesse. This was great. Really enjoyed the conversation. Enlightened, learned a couple of new tidbits. And thank you to all the participants. We really we're looking forward to seeing you next time and on the 27th. And we hope you all have a great rest of your day.
Great. Thank you so much, everyone. Have a great day.
Take care. Bye-bye, everyone.
Bye-bye.